In a lot of families, money was never talked about. Not because there wasn't any, not because the parents didn't care, but because money was private. It was off limits, kind of subject that got shut down before it started. With a look or a redirect, that's not something we discuss. Maybe that was your family. Maybe you grew up knowing roughly that things were either okay or not okay, but never knowing the details, never being a part of any conversation about money that went deeper than we can't afford that right now, or never hearing even that because nothing was ever explained. Or maybe you grew up in a household that had money, real money, and it was still never discussed. Because in some families, wealth is its own kind of secret. You don't let people know, you keep it quiet, and you trust that the children will figure it out when the time comes. Most people don't think of that silence as traumatic, but I want to talk about what that silence actually does to a child's developing relationship with money and what it keeps doing quietly without anyone realizing it and the financial decisions that child makes as an adult. My name is Jamila McClooney, and I'm a licensed fiduciary financial advisor certified in the trauma of money. This is a conversation I have with almost every client who comes into my practice, wondering why their relationship with money feels harder than it should. Let's work. Here's something fundamental about how children work. Children are meaning-making machines, right? When something happens around them or doesn't happen, they don't experience it as neutral. They interpret it and they assign meaning to it. And the meaning they assign becomes a belief that shapes how they see the world for a very long time. So when a child grows up in a home where money is never really discussed, they don't experience the silence as simply a topic being excluded from conversation. They experience it as information. And depending on the child and the family, they draw one of three conclusions about that silence. The first conclusion is that money is dangerous. When every time money comes up, someone gets tense or they change the subject or they leave the room, the child's nervous system registers that avoidance as evidence of a threat, not because anything specific has happened, but because the body reads the discomfort in the room as a signal. And that association, money equals something unsafe, gets wired in before the child ever has a dollar of their own. The second conclusion is that money is shameful. In some families, the silence isn't tense, it's humiliated. The subject gets changed quickly with a look that says, "This is not something we talk about." And for a child that reads as, "There's something wrong with our situation that we need to hide," and that shame doesn't stay in the childhood home. It follows the adult into every financial conversation they avoid for the rest of their life. The third conclusion, and this one surprises people, is that money is something other people manage, not us. In families where money is never discussed, children arrive at adulthood with no model for how to think about it, talk about it, or make decisions about it. And not because they weren't intelligent, but because nobody showed them that money was something you engage with deliberately. It just existed or it didn't, and they dealt with what came. Now, here's what's important. None of these three beliefs require a crisis to form, right? None of them require poverty or abuse or neglect. They form in ordinary, loving, functional families where nobody ever sat down and explained what the silence meant. Now I want to get specific about what money silence looks like in adult life, because this is where most people start to recognize themselves. The first pattern is financial avoidance. Adults who grew up with money silence are significantly more likely to avoid looking at their own finances. Again, they're not being irresponsible, but they've learned that looking at money directly was never modeled as a safe or normal activity in their home. So in the family of origin, you didn't engage with money, you stayed away from the subject. And that same instinct carries forward. The account doesn't get checked regularly or if at all. The statement goes unopened. The full financial picture never gets examined all at once. And here's like the painful irony of that. The person might be highly capable, highly accomplished, and functioning at a high level in every other area of their life. But when it comes to looking at money directly, something happens in the body that they just can't fully explain, a kind of pulling away, a resistance that doesn't make logical sense. That resistance has a name, and it's the body's memory of what engaging with money, what once felt like. Let's look at the second pattern. The second pattern is financial secrecy in relationships. So people who grew up in money silent households often replicate that silence in their own partnerships. It's not intentional though, but it's the only model that they have to copy, so that's what tends to come out. Money simply isn't something that gets brought up naturally, and when a partner brings it up, it can feel intrusive, as if the conversation itself is crossing a line they didn't even know that they'd drawn. This can play out in marriages where one partner manages all the finances and the other genuinely doesn't know what they have. It plays out in couples where significant financial decisions get made without discussion. And it plays out in the growing distance between two people who love each other but are living in the same silence they grew up in. The third pattern is paralysis when the financial stakes feel high. So when someone grew up with money silence, they face a major financial decision that they have to do or figure out, a significant investment or a conversation with an advisor or a complicated tax situation. They often just freeze, not because they have a lack of information, but from a deep sense of not feeling or being equipped, of not knowing enough, or of being in territory that was never made safe. And what they're experiencing is the gap between the financial education they needed and the one the silence took away. And that gap shows up most acutely exactly when the decisions matter most. The fourth pattern is outsourcing without understanding. So some adults from money silent homes, they respond by delegating their finances entirely to a spouse, a family member. They just deliberately stay out of it. They're not being lazy with it. It's the only relationship with money that they ever saw modeled. So you don't engage with it directly. You let somebody else handle it. The problem is that you cannot protect what you don't understand, right? The silence that felt like safety in childhood becomes a different kind of vulnerability in adulthood. The fifth pattern is the inability to talk about money in close relationships. And this may be the most quietly damaging of all the five. So adults from money silent homes, they often find it just difficult to talk about money with the people they love most, with partners, with their own children, with aging parents who need financial conversations and don't know how to start them. But not because they are disinterested in the topic. It's because the conversation itself feels off limits in a way they can't explain. And so the silence continues and it replicates into the next generation, into the next relationship, into the next family that will one day wonder why money was never talked about. I want to speak to something that I see in my financial practice that I don't really hear talked about anywhere. High earners who grew up with money silence are among the most financially vulnerable people that I work with. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, right? Because they're successful, they're earning real money, they have access to advisors and resources and information that most people don't have. But here's what's really happening. A person who grew up with that money silence, and let's say they now earn $300,000 a year, they have more money that's unprotected, more decisions being made without a framework for making them, or more complexity to navigate with no model for navigating it. And they're dealing with a particularly painful version of the pattern because the income creates a story. The story says they should have figured this out by now, that someone who earns this well shouldn't still be struggling with the basic act of looking at their finances, or that the silence they grew up in shouldn't still be a factor at this income level. That shame of not knowing what they feel they should know, is one of the primary reasons high earners don't ask for help. But it's not because they don't need it. It's because asking for help feels like admitting that that silence did something to them. And the truth is, it did. But naming that and truly sitting with the fact that the silence in your childhood home is still influencing your financial decisions right now is not weakness. It's actually one of the most financially sophisticated and brave things that you can do, because you can't address what you won't name. And the moment you name it, something shifts. Let me tell you what I've seen happen when someone who grows up with money silence and they decide to break it, that habit. Well, it doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't start with a financial product or a new account or a better budget. It starts with a conversation. And that may seem like, why does it start with a conversation? But usually the first honest conversation that person has ever had about money is where that starts. Not a practical version of that conversation, but a real one. I ask every new client the same question before I look at a single number. And you may have heard me say this if you've watched any of my videos, but I say, what did money feel like in your home when you were growing up? Not what happened with money, but how it felt. And I usually can tell within the first few sentences whether someone grew up with money silence, because the answer is usually some version of, I honestly don't know, or we didn't talk about it, or I have no idea what was really going on. I could see the moment they connect the dots, that the not knowing wasn't neutral, that it taught them something, that what it taught them is still running in the background of their financial lives and all of their financial decisions. So that moment of recognition, as often as it is where the real work begins. And from there, things start to shift in very specific ways. They start looking at their accounts, not all at once and not without discomfort, but more regularly, more directly, more intentionally. The act of looking becomes less threatening as it becomes more familiar. They may even start the money conversations with their partner, awkwardly at first, maybe in pieces, but the seal gets broken, and what was once unspeakable becomes something that they can navigate together. They even start making financial decisions actively instead of just by default. And the one that moves me the most every time is when they start talking to their children about money, and not lecturing, not anxiously, just talking, naming what things cost, explaining what decisions they're making with the money and why, giving their children the one thing that they never had, a model of an adult who engages with money directly and treats it as something that can be understood, discussed, and handled without shame. That is how the silence ends, not with a perfect portfolio, with one person who decides the pattern stops here. If anything in this video landed, if you recognize the patterns, or you felt the weight of the silence, or you saw yourself in what I described, that recognition is important. It means something just became visible that may have been invisible before. And what's visible can be changed. If you're ready to have the real money conversation, not the budgeting version, but the real one, that's exactly the work that I do every day. The link to book a complimentary strategy call is in the description. It's 45 minutes, no pitch, no pressure, just an honest look at where you are and what's actually possible from here. And if this video made you think of someone who you know grew up in the same silence, someone who might be carrying this without realizing it, share it with them. The silence ends when someone decides to speak. I'll see you in the next one.